Have you ever noticed how some things just click for you? Maybe you instantly grasp a melody or figure out how something works, but then other things, like fractions in school, were a total struggle.
It really makes you wonder if intelligence is really just one thing that you can measure, right?
Right. Like, are we all just smart or not smart, or is there something more to it? And for our listeners who are clearly interested in learning and want to get a deep understanding of things quickly and efficiently, this question is probably pretty relevant.
Well, the good news is that we're diving into a theory that challenges that traditional view of intelligence. Dr. Howard Gardner has been exploring this idea for decades, and his book, Frames of Mind, The Theory of Multiple Intelligences, really shook things up in the field.
And lucky for us, we have a couple of great sources to work with for this deep dive. We'll be looking at Gardner's own reflections on his work after 30 years, as well as the core ideas from Frames of Mind itself.
Exactly. So think of this as your shortcut to becoming an expert on multiple intelligences. We're going to explore the origins of Gardner's thinking, the evidence he found, the different types of intelligence he identified, and even how culture plays a role in shaping them.
That sounds great. So to give our listeners a roadmap for this journey, where are we headed? What are the key stops along the way?
So first, we're going to start by understanding the experiences that led to Gardner's initial ideas. Then we'll contrast his pluralistic view of intelligence with that older, more traditional idea of a single, general intelligence, and we'll even touch on some other big psychological theories that were around at the time. Then we're going to get to the really interesting stuff, exploring each of Gardner's intelligences in detail with real examples from his writing. And finally, we'll look at what all of this means for how we learn and how our cultures function.
Okay, so we've established that traditional views of intelligence might be too narrow, but what was that turning point for Gardner? What experiences led him down this different path?
Well, unlike a lot of intelligence researchers, Gardner didn't come to this through traditional IQ testing. He actually spent 20 years immersed in neuropsychology, the study of the brain and how it's organized. He worked on a neuropsychological unit, studying how damage to different parts of the brain can affect our abilities.
So he was literally seeing how specific areas of the brain seem to be responsible for different mental functions.
Exactly. He witnessed firsthand how someone who had a stroke, for example, might lose the ability to speak, but still be perfectly capable of solving math problems or composing music.
So he was seeing that the brain wasn't just one big blob of intelligence, but that different parts had specialized roles.
Exactly. And his earlier work, a book called The Shattered Mind, published in 1975, really documented this connection between specific brain regions and the things our minds can do. It was around 1976 that he started thinking about writing a book on this concept, which he was going to call Kinds of Minds.
So it wasn't a sudden eureka moment, but more of a slow burn, a gradual realization based on his hands-on work with the brain.
Exactly. And over time, that initial idea for Kinds of Minds really transformed and expanded into what eventually became Frames of Mind. And when Frames of Mind was finally published, Gardner initially saw it as a way to contribute to the fields of developmental psychology, how people grow and learn, and to the cognitive sciences, which look at how we think and process information. He wanted to challenge those limitations of just using paper and pencil tests to define intelligence.
He wanted to broaden the definition of intelligence beyond just filling in bubbles on a test sheet.
Right. He really wanted to bring in that knowledge of the brain and the amazing diversity of talents we see across different cultures. And it's interesting because at the time, he didn't really anticipate the huge impact his ideas would have on the field of education.
It's fascinating how an idea that starts in one field can end up completely revolutionizing another.
It is. And it just goes to show that these fields are all interconnected, and sometimes it takes someone with a fresh perspective to make those connections and see things in a new light.
So let's dig into what exactly Gardner was challenging with this framework of multiple intelligences. What was the prevailing view of intelligence at the time?
Okay, so the big idea that had been around for a while, supported by researchers like Spearman and Terman, was this concept of a single general intelligence, often called G. This basically means that they thought intelligence was one overall mental capacity, and that if you were good at one type of mental task, you'd probably be pretty good at most others too.
So the idea was that if you aced your vocabulary test, you'd probably also do well on logic puzzles and spatial reasoning tasks.
That was the thinking. But Gardner argued that the picture was much more complex and nuanced than that. He wasn't just looking at correlations between different abilities on tests. He was looking at a much broader range of evidence. He was drawing on what we know about how the brain works, how certain skills evolved in humans over time, and how different cultures value and nurture different talents.
So he was taking a more holistic approach, looking at the whole person and their environment, not just how they perform on a standardized test.
Exactly. And he was particularly critical of relying so heavily on IQ tests to define intelligence. He pointed out that these tests are often geared towards skills that are developed through formal schooling, things like reading comprehension, math, and logic. But they don't necessarily reflect the full range of human capabilities or predict success in real-world settings.
So someone could score really high on an IQ test, but still struggle with things like social interactions, creative problem solving, or practical skills.
Exactly. And he also noted that IQ scores, while they can predict academic achievement to some degree, they don't necessarily tell us much about a person's success in other areas of life, especially when you factor in things like socioeconomic background and opportunity.
It makes sense. We all know people who are brilliant in some areas, but maybe not so much in others. It's like they have different kinds of intelligence. And of course, there's that whole debate about whether IQ is primarily inherited, which Gardner felt was a very limited way of looking at intelligence.
Right. He believed that our genes play a role, but so do our experiences, our environment, and the opportunities we have to learn and grow. So to understand Gardner's theory, we also need to consider the context of other psychological theories that were popular at the time. How did his ideas relate to Piaget's stage theory of development, for example, or the information processing approach?
Good point. Tijo's theory was huge in developmental psychology. What did Gardner think of that?
Well, Piaget, he really focused on these underlying mental structures that he believed developed in a specific sequence in all children. He really emphasized those forms of intelligence that aligned with Western scientific and philosophical traditions, things like logical reasoning and abstract thinking.
But Gardner felt that Piaget's view, while important, also had its limitations.
He did. He pointed out that Piaget's experiments often involved very specific tasks that relied on verbal instructions and were done in artificial laboratory settings. So they might not have captured the full complexity of how people think and learn in real-world situations. And Piaget theory didn't really address things like creativity in the arts or in more practical, hands-on domains.
So Piaget's theory was important for understanding cognitive development, but it didn't tell the whole story. What about the information processing approach? How did that fit in?
So information processing psychology tended to break down thinking into these specific steps and mechanisms, kind of like a computer processing data. And Gardner felt that while this approach was good at analyzing specific mental processes, it often lacked a bigger picture. It didn't offer a unifying theory that could connect different ways of thinking, and like Piaget's work, it often focused on logical and mathematical problem solving.
So while both Piaget and the information processing folks contributed valuable ideas, neither fully captured that wide range of human intellectual abilities that Gardner was observing.
Precisely. And that's what led him to develop his own framework, which recognized those different frames of mind, as he called them.
And it wasn't just a random list, right? He had specific criteria that he used to identify what constituted an intelligence.
Exactly. So while we won't go through all of them, some of the key things he looked for were: could that ability be isolated by brain damage? Meaning, could someone lose that specific skill while others remained intact? He also looked at the existence of prodigies and savants, individuals who show exceptional talent in one area but maybe have limitations in others. He also considered whether that intelligence had a distinct developmental history, how it emerges and changes over a person's lifespan, and whether it had a plausible evolutionary basis.
So it wasn't just based on his own observations, but he was looking for evidence from multiple sources.
Exactly. He also considered whether there was support from experimental psychology and psychometric studies, which are those that involve measuring mental abilities, and whether the intelligence could be represented through a system of symbols like language, music notation, or mathematical formulas. All of these different lines of evidence helped him build his case for the existence of multiple intelligences.
Okay, so that gives us a good foundation for understanding his approach. Now let's get into the specific intelligences he proposed, starting with linguistic intelligence, which seems pretty fundamental to how we humans communicate.
It is. Linguistic intelligence at its core is all about sensitivity to the sounds, rhythms, meanings, and different uses of words in language. It's the ability to use language effectively, to communicate, to express yourself, to persuade others, to tell stories, to learn new information. Gardner points out that language has been a central focus of study for a really long time, and for good reason. It's a uniquely human capability that plays a huge role in our lives.
And he uses some really great examples to illustrate this, doesn't he?
He does. For example, he talks about how a poet, like Robert Graves, might spend hours agonizing over finding just the right word to convey a specific image or feeling. He used the example of the word call, which has a very particular meaning and evokes a certain kind of imagery. And he talks about how T.S. Eliot, the famous poet, cautioned against putting certain words together because they create a jarring or unpleasant effect.
So it's not just about knowing a lot of words, but about having a deep understanding of their nuances and how they work together.
Exactly. He also mentions Jean-Paul Sartre, the French philosopher and writer, who from a very young age was incredibly drawn to writing. He saw writing as a way to make sense of the world and to connect with others. It was like his primary mode of being.
It's like some people just have this natural affinity for language. They think in words and stories.
They do. And then on the flip side, you have those with specific language impairments who struggle to understand or produce language. And those cases actually provide further evidence for the idea that linguistic intelligence is a distinct ability.
So it's like the brain has a specific language center that can be affected by injury or developmental differences.
Right. And Gardner mentions how some individuals with intellectual disabilities, while they might struggle in other areas, can still master the basic sounds and grammar of language, even if their understanding of more complex concepts is limited.
That's amazing. So even in the face of other challenges, the brain's capacity for language can still shine through.
It can. And then you have these fascinating cases of hyperlexic children, kids who learn to read at an incredibly early age, sometimes even before they start speaking fluently. This often happens in children with autism who might have significant challenges with social communication, but they have this incredible ability to decode words and read fluently, even if they don't always fully grasp the meaning of what they're reading.
That's mind-blowing. It really shows how complex and specialized the brain's language systems are.
It does. And there's also evidence from brain imaging studies that shows how different parts of the brain are involved in different aspects of language processing. For example, the left hemisphere of the brain is usually dominant for understanding syntax, which is the grammatical structure of sentences. And there have been studies where people with damage to the left hemisphere struggle to understand sentences where the meaning depends on the order of the words, like the difference between the truck hit the bus and the bus hit the truck.
Right. The meaning changes completely depending on which word comes first. And Gardner also mentions the development of sign language in deaf children as another example of our innate capacity for language.
Yes, deaf children who are exposed to sign language from a young age develop it just as naturally and fluently as hearing children develop spoken language, even though the modality is completely different. It really shows how our brains are wired for language, regardless of whether it's spoken or signed.
And then there's that heartbreaking case of Jeannie, the child who was isolated for years and deprived of any meaningful language exposure. Even after she was rescued, she had extreme difficulty with grammar, suggesting that there might be a critical period for fully developing certain aspects of language.
Right. Jeannie's case is a tragic example of how crucial early exposure to language is for normal language development. And this has implications for how we approach education, especially for children who might have language delays or learning disabilities.
So thinking about how different parts of the brain are involved in language can help us tailor our teaching methods to individual students' strengths and weaknesses.
Exactly. Gardner suggests that since there seem to be different pathways to reading, some people might be more visually oriented and others might be more auditory learners. He suggests that children who struggle with sounding out words might benefit from a more visual approach to reading, while those who have difficulty with sight words might benefit from more phonics instruction.
So there isn't just one right way to teach reading, just like there isn't just one way to be linguistically intelligent.
Precisely. And that's one of the core messages of multiple intelligences theory, that we need to recognize and appreciate the diversity of ways in which people think and learn.
Okay, let's move on to another intelligence that Gardner identified: musical intelligence.
Ah, yes, music. This one is about much more than just enjoying listening to music. It's about having a sensitivity to melody, rhythm, pitch, timbre, and the ability to perceive, appreciate, and create musical patterns.
So you don't have to be a virtuoso musician to have musical intelligence.
Not at all. It can manifest in many different ways. Some people might be naturally gifted singers, while others might have a knack for playing instruments, composing music, or simply appreciating and understanding different musical styles and genres.
And one of the interesting things about musical intelligence is how early it can emerge in some individuals, sometimes even more so than talents in other areas.
Exactly. Think about those child prodigies who can play complex piano pieces or compose their own symphonies at an age when most kids are still learning their ABCs.
It's almost like they were born with music already wired into their brains.
It can seem that way. And what's also fascinating is that while both language and music rely on our ability to process sound, they seem to be handled by different parts of the nervous system. So damage to one area of the brain might affect your language abilities, but leave your musical abilities intact, or vice versa.
So you could have someone who's a brilliant musician but struggles with reading or writing, or someone who's a gifted writer but can't carry a tune.
Precisely. And Gardner uses some great examples from the world of music to illustrate how musical intelligence works. He quotes Mozart, describing how musical ideas would come to him fully formed, a complete sequence of sounds and rhythms all at once. He said it was like dictation, where the music was already written in his mind and he just had to get it down on paper.
Wow, that's amazing. Like the music was already there waiting to be discovered.
Exactly. And then you have Stravinsky, who took a more hands-on approach to composing. He saw it more as a process of doing, of experimenting with sounds and rhythms until something clicked.
So some composers might be more intuitive, while others are more deliberate and methodical.
It seems so. And then there's Schoenberg, who, quoting Schopenhauer, said that music is the inmost essence of the world. He believed that music could reveal profound truths that words simply couldn't express.
It's like music bypasses the logical part of our brain and speaks directly to our emotions and our deepest intuitions.
Exactly. And the way different cultures approach music also tells us a lot about how musical intelligence is valued and developed.
Oh, absolutely. Music plays such different roles in different societies.
Right. Gardner contrasts cultures like the Inang of Nigeria, where music and dance are integral to everyday life, with cultures where musical development might be more formalized or specialized. He mentions the griots of West Africa, these master musicians and storytellers who undergo years of apprenticeship to learn their craft. And he talks about how in some cultures, there are almost ritualistic ways of passing musical knowledge from one generation to the next. It's like they have a deep understanding of how to cultivate musical talent.
So it's not just about having a natural ear for music, but about having the right environment and the right kind of instruction to nurture those abilities.
Exactly. And Gardner emphasizes that talent alone isn't enough. It needs to be nurtured and developed through hard work, dedication, and the right kind of mentoring. He talks about the pianist Arthur Rubinstein, who was clearly a prodigy but still had to overcome periods of self-doubt and really work at his craft to become the master musician he was.
So even someone with natural talent needs to have the motivation and the discipline to really excel.
Absolutely. And he also notes that personality and character play a role in musical achievement. He quotes the pianist Rudolf Serkin, who said that you could spot talent in young musicians, but their character, their ability to persevere through challenges, and their passion for music were ultimately what determined whether they'd become truly great artists.
And I love how Gardner uses the example of birdsong to illustrate some of these points about musical intelligence.
Yes, it's a fascinating analogy. Just like human musicality, birdsong is often localized in one side of the bird's brain, the left side in many species, and damage to that area can disrupt their ability to sing, similar to how brain damage can affect language or musical abilities in humans.
So even though birdsong might sound simple to us, it's actually a complex and sophisticated form of communication that requires specialized brain structures.
Exactly. And researchers have even observed changes in the brain structures of birds as they learn and refine their songs. It's like their brains are physically changing as they become more musically proficient. And it suggests that there might be some fundamental similarities in how these complex auditory sequences are organized in the brains of birds and humans.
Okay, that's a great segue to our next intelligence. Logical mathematical intelligence. This is often what people think of when they hear the word intelligence.
It is. It's the ability to reason logically, to recognize patterns, to solve problems, to think abstractly, and to understand and manipulate numbers and symbols. It's the kind of intelligence that's often valued in academic settings and in fields like science, technology, engineering, and math.
And Gardner acknowledges that for people who aren't deeply immersed in mathematics, it can seem very abstract and difficult to grasp.
It can. It's not always as immediately obvious how these skills translate into real-world applications as it is with, say, linguistic or musical intelligence. But mathematical thinking is all around us, from the way we design buildings and bridges to the algorithms that run our computers and smartphones.
It's the underlying logic of the universe.
Exactly. And he talks about how mathematicians often experience these moments of sudden insight, these aha moments where the solution to a problem just pops into their heads even before they can fully explain all the steps involved.
It's like they intuitively grasp the answer and then they have to work backwards to figure out how they got there.
That's a great way to put it. The mathematician Poincaré even described having one of these moments while stepping onto a bus. He suddenly saw the solution to a problem that had been plaguing him for weeks.
And that's the beauty of the human mind, isn't it? That ability to make these leaps of intuition and insight.
It is. But Gardner also points out that intuition is only part of the story. To be truly convincing, mathematicians also need to be able to demonstrate the logical steps and provide rigorous proofs for their ideas.
So it's a combination of both intuition and logical rigor.
Right. And he talks about how different mathematicians might lean more heavily on one or the other. Some might be more comfortable with abstract concepts and intuitive leaps, while others might be more grounded in the concrete and methodical process of working through proofs.
What are some of the things that really motivate and excite mathematicians? What drives them to keep exploring these complex ideas?
Well, Gardner mentions the thrill of solving problems that have stumped people for centuries, of pushing the boundaries of knowledge and of discovering new mathematical truths. He talks about the satisfaction of finding unexpected connections between seemingly unrelated ideas and the joy of creating elegant and beautiful mathematical proofs.
It's almost like an artistic pursuit in a way, isn't it? The search for beauty and elegance in these abstract realms.
It is. And he also mentions the satisfaction of grappling with ideas that seem to defy common sense, like imaginary numbers or paradoxes. He even brings up Lewis Carroll, the author of Alice in Wonderland, who was a brilliant mathematician and logician in addition to being a writer.
That's fascinating. It makes sense, though, when you think about the kind of logical puzzles and wordplay that Carroll was so good at.
Exactly. He had a deep understanding of logic and language, and he used those skills to create these wonderfully surreal and imaginative worlds.
And Gardner highlights the remarkable mathematician John von Neumann, known for his incredible speed of thought and his ability to grasp complex ideas quickly.
Oh yes, von Neumann was a true genius. He made significant contributions to a wide range of fields, from mathematics and physics to computer science and economics. He was known for his ability to identify the most important problems and to tackle them with incredible focus and intellectual courage.
And despite his incredible logical abilities, he didn't always trust his own intuition, did he?
Apparently not. He often felt the need to rigorously test his ideas and work through all the steps to make sure they were sound. And that really highlights how different approaches to problem solving can be equally effective.
And the close relationship between mathematics and science is undeniable, isn't it?
Absolutely. Throughout history, mathematical concepts have been essential for scientific breakthroughs. From the ancient Greeks' work on geometry, which helped explain planetary motion, to calculus, which allowed us to understand motion and change, to the development of quantum mechanics, which relied heavily on advanced mathematical tools.
So math is the language of science.
It is. And Gardner talks about how scientists often rely on intuition as well, although it might be a different kind of intuition than what mathematicians experience. He talks about how scientists often have a deep feel for the natural world, a sense of what the underlying principles might be that explain how things work.
It's like they can see the patterns and connections that others might miss.
Exactly. He quotes Heisenberg, one of the founders of quantum mechanics, talking about Niels Bohr, another great physicist. He said that Bohr had this almost instinctive ability to create models of atomic processes, even when those models seem to contradict existing ideas.
And true scientific originality isn't just about having a sudden eureka moment. It also requires persistence, dedication, and a willingness to challenge established ideas.
Precisely. And Gardner uses Einstein as a perfect example of this. Einstein's development of the theory of relativity was a long and arduous process. It wasn't just one brilliant flash of insight. It involved years of grappling with complex ideas, testing hypotheses, and refining his theories.
And he was willing to stick with it even when others doubted him.
He was. He had the intellectual courage to pursue his ideas even when they challenged the prevailing scientific paradigms. And he also had a deep understanding of the fundamental questions that were driving his research, those really big questions about the nature of space, time, and gravity.
He wasn't just trying to solve a puzzle, he was trying to understand the universe.
Exactly. And he was willing to put in the time and effort to do so. He wasn't afraid to make mistakes, to revise his theories, and to keep pushing forward until he arrived at a solution that satisfied him.
And that's an important lesson for all of us, isn't it? That true innovation often involves a lot of trial and error and a willingness to embrace uncertainty.
It does. And Gardner also talks about how early experiences can sometimes shape our logical mathematical thinking. He mentions the mathematician Stanislaw Ulam, who was fascinated by the patterns in an oriental rug as a child. He felt that those visual patterns had a hidden mathematical order to them, and that this early fascination might have contributed to his later mathematical achievements.
So it's like our brains are primed to look for patterns and to make sense of the world around us, even from a very young age.
It seems so. And Gardner even observed this in his own research, where he noticed that some young children were particularly drawn to repetitive designs and patterns, while others were more interested in storytelling and dramatic play. He called these children patterners and dramatists, respectively.
And it's possible that these early preferences might hint at a predisposition for different types of intellectual strength.
That's an interesting possibility. Of course, it's not a guarantee, but it suggests that there might be individual differences in how our brains are wired that emerge very early in life. And he also talks about how there seems to be a peak age for making groundbreaking contributions in mathematics and science.
Really? So it's not just a matter of experience and knowledge accumulating over time.
It seems not. He points out that many of the most significant discoveries in these fields are often made by people in their 20s and 30s, with truly revolutionary work becoming less common later in life.
It's like there's a certain kind of mental agility and flexibility that's more common in younger minds.
It's possible. He quotes mathematicians like G.H. Hardy and I. Rabi, who reflected on this phenomenon, suggesting that younger mathematicians often have a freshness of perspective and a willingness to take risks that might diminish as they get older.
So maybe there's a trade-off between experience and that youthful boldness.
And maybe so. And what's interesting is that Gardner doesn't just focus on logical mathematical thinking in Western cultures. He also looks at how these abilities manifest in other societies, challenging the idea that it's solely a product of Western thought.
Right. It's not just about being good at abstract math equations.
Exactly. He talks about how people in cultures without formal schooling often develop incredible estimation skills, which are essential for survival and for navigating their environments. He mentions the Capel people of Liberia, who were better at estimating quantities of rice than many educated Western adults. And he talks about the Trobriand Islanders, who use complex logical reasoning to settle land ownership disputes.
So logical thinking can take many different forms depending on the context and the challenges that people face.
Precisely. And that's a key takeaway from Gardner's work, that intelligence is not a one-size-fits-all concept. It manifests in diverse ways. And what's considered intelligent in one culture might be completely different in another.
Okay, let's move on to spatial intelligence. It's about more than just being good at reading maps.
Definitely. Spatial intelligence is all about our ability to perceive the visual world accurately, to manipulate and transform those perceptions mentally, and to recreate visual experiences in our minds, even when the original object is not present.
So it's like having a mental map of the world around you.
That's a good analogy.
Yeah.
And it involves not just seeing things clearly, but also being able to imagine them from different perspectives, to rotate them in your mind, and to understand how they fit together spatially.
And he talks about how there's a distinction between just perceiving something visually and actually being able to mentally manipulate it.
Right. Someone might have perfect eyesight, but still struggle to mentally rotate a three-dimensional object or visualize how something would look from a different angle. These are distinct but related aspects of spatial intelligence. And the psychologist Roger Shepard did some fascinating research on mental rotation tasks, where he found that the time it takes people to decide if two shapes are the same increases as the angle of rotation increases.
So the more you have to mentally rotate an object, the longer it takes to process it.
Exactly. And that suggests that we're actually engaging in some kind of mental manipulation, almost like we're physically rotating the object in our minds. And what's really amazing is that even people who are born blind can exhibit spatial abilities.
Really? How is that possible if they've never actually seen the world?
It's fascinating, isn't it? Research by Gloria Marmer showed that blind children can also mentally rotate objects they've explored by touch and understand concepts like mirror images, which suggests that they're building spatial representations through their sense of touch rather than through vision. And then there's the incredible case of a young blind child studied by Barbara Landau who could navigate between locations that she had only experienced from a third-person perspective.
So she was able to build a mental map of her environment based on verbal descriptions and her own movements through space.
Exactly. It's like she was constructing a virtual reality in her mind based on non-visual information. And this really challenges the idea that spatial intelligence is solely dependent on vision.
And we also see extraordinary spatial abilities in some individuals with autism and savant syndrome.
Yes, there are many cases of savants who have exceptional abilities in areas like drawing, sculpture, or map making, even if they struggle in other areas. And Gardner highlights the case of Nadia, a young autistic girl who had an incredible talent for drawing.
And what's striking is that these abilities often emerge very early in life and seem to be almost effortless for them.
They do. It's like they have this innate ability to perceive and represent the world visually in a way that most people simply can't. And while we don't fully understand how these abilities develop, it suggests that there might be unique neural pathways or ways of processing information in these individuals.
And you wouldn't think that playing blindfolded chess would be a spatial task, but it actually is, isn't it?
It is. Binet, one of the pioneers of intelligence research, considered playing blindfolded chess to be a strong indicator of spatial intelligence because it requires the ability to hold a complex visual representation in your mind and to manipulate it mentally.
You have to keep track of all the pieces on the board and imagine how they'd move even though you can't see them.
Exactly. And some players even use memory techniques to help them remember the positions of the pieces.
So it's like a mental workout for your spatial abilities.
It is. And Gardner also talks about the obvious connection between spatial intelligence and the visual arts.
Of course, artists need to have a strong sense of space and form.
They do. And he quotes various artists talking about the importance of composition, balance, and perspective in their work. He mentions Picasso emphasizing the formal elements in art and Constable viewing painting, almost as a scientific investigation into the laws of nature.
It's interesting that he compares artists to mathematicians and scientists in this way.
It is. And he even quotes Clive Bell, an art critic, who suggested that artists like Virginia Woolf and Picasso operated on a similar intellectual level to mathematicians, just expressing their insights through different means.
It's like they're all exploring different facets of the same underlying reality, just using different tools and languages.
Exactly. And he also talks about the role of memory in spatial intelligence. He mentions the art historian Kenneth Clark, who had an incredible ability to recall visual details even years after seeing them.
It's like he had a photographic memory for art.
It seems so. And this ability to store and retrieve visual information is essential for many spatial tasks, from navigating your environment to creating art.
And spatial intelligence isn't just for artists and chess players. It has very practical applications in many different fields.
Absolutely. Gardner talks about the remarkable navigational skills of the Eskimos who can navigate vast distances through the Arctic landscape, using only subtle cues in the snow and ice. And he also mentions the Puluot people of the Caroline Islands, who are known for their ability to navigate across the ocean using only the stars.
It's like they have a built-in GPS.
They do. And what's amazing is that their navigation systems are based on a deep understanding of the environment, of the stars, the wind, the waves, and even the behavior of birds. It's a holistic and intuitive form of spatial intelligence that's been honed over generations.
It's a reminder that intelligence is not just about what's in our heads. It's also about our relationship with the world around us.
Exactly. And that brings us to another intelligence that Gardner identified: bodily kinesthetic intelligence.
Now, this one is often associated with athletes and dancers, but it's about much more than just being physically skilled, right?
It is. Bodily kinesthetic intelligence is about having a mastery of your body, the ability to control your movements with precision and grace, and to use your body to express yourself, to solve problems, and to create things.
So it's not just about brute strength or athleticism. It's about fine motor skills, coordination, and an awareness of your body in space.
Exactly. Think about a surgeon performing a delicate operation, a craftsperson creating intricate designs with their hands, or an actor conveying emotions through their physical movements.
And Gardner talks about how some movements can become almost automatic, like a pianist playing a familiar piece or a dancer performing a well-rehearsed routine.
Right. With practice, these complex sequences of movements become so ingrained that we can perform them effortlessly without having to consciously think about each step. It's like our bodies have a memory of their own.
And there's a